The United States sent a clear message to China with the capture of Maduro, and that is to stay away from Latin America.
We don't want to have China there.
China will never buy any story by any country in the world that they have the military capabilities to deny China's access to the great continent of Latin America. No way. If they want to have war, they will get war.
When it comes to Chinese investments in Latin America, Venezuela is just the tip of the iceberg. China is involved in 37 ports across the continent. Much of China's lithium comes from the Lithium Triangle of Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia. Latin American agricultural products contribute to almost 1/3 of China's food imports. And major Chinese brands like EV manufacturer BYD has set up factories in Brazil. Meanwhile, Trump invokes a foreign policy strategy dubbed the Monroe doctrine. It aims to get China out of what Washington considers its backyard. Could Venezuela be just the start?
The key country that we have to keep our eye on right now in Latin America is Panama. This is going to be the most important country in this burgeoning duel between the US and China, because the United States is threatening to shut China out of the Panama Canal Zone. And if they do that, that would be potentially an existential threat to China's trade relationship in this vital part of the world.
The Trump administration has also threatened Cuba and Colombia, sparking protests in those countries.
没有哪个国家可以充当国际警察。
Why is Latin America emerging as a key theater in US-China competition? The United States' direct operation in Venezuela, capturing President Maduro and his wife, has generated international shockwaves. There are many reasons behind it. President Trump revealed his intentions just days after the operation.
One thing I think everyone has to know is that if we didn't do this, China or Russia would have done it. And if China or Russia were a next-door neighbor, because essentially this is not around the other parts of the world so far away where you fly in an airplane for 24 hours before you get there. This is sort of a next-door neighbor if you think about it. And I told China and I told Russia, we get along with you very well, we like you very much, we don't want you there, not going to be there. And if we didn't do this, China would have been there and Russia would have been there. Maybe they both would have been there together, but they're not going to be there now.
Much has already been uncovered about China-Venezuela ties. China invests more in Venezuela than in any other Latin American country. China was Venezuela's largest oil buyer, accounting for around 80% of all oil exports. And Venezuela has been supporting de-dollarization by pricing oil in yuan since September 2017, when Maduro declared the country would free itself from the dollar tyranny. Venezuela and China had strong ties, but it is really just the tip of the iceberg when one is examining the strides that China has been making in Latin America over the last decade. May 2025, President Xi Jinping hosted heads of states and officials from 28 Latin American and Caribbean countries in Beijing, while dishing out $9.2 billion in credit. The forum takes place as country leaders mull over how to deal with tariffs from the United States.
霸凌霸道，只会孤立自身。中国同拉美和加勒比国家都是全球南方重要成员。独立自主是我们的光荣传统，发展振兴是我们的天然权利。
China's trade with the region has grown sharply over the last decade. mainly from rising imports of the region's farm goods like soybeans and beef, along with other imports like crude oil and critical minerals. The growing trade has fueled unease in Washington, even under the Biden administration.
Today, I am here to announce that great-powered competition is back in the Americas. The hammer and the sickle has returned in full force, and the Chinese Communist Party's first order of business is to own Latin America, our backyard. China has secured a presence in Latin America through what we could call a Trojan horse strategy to become the #1 trading partner in our region. Let me repeat it. Our hemisphere has been invaded by China, and they are now the #1 trading partner in the region. #1 trading partner in the region. 20 years ago, they traded $12 billion. 20 years later, last year, they hit $450 billion. That is a 3,000% increase, 3,000% increase.
Trade volume between China and Latin American countries reached a record $518.4 billion in 2024. Investments from China have also poured into the region. In the area of critical minerals, China has invested heavily in the Lithium Triangle, which is one of the most important geostrategic sectors in Latin America. Spanning through Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia, the Lithium Triangle is home to between 60 to 75% of the Earth's known lithium reserves. China has invested in various aspects of the operations in the three countries. In Bolivia, for example, it was reported in 2024 that Chinese companies invested $1 billion in lithium extraction plants. Lithium from those three countries is critical to grow China's global dominance in the electric vehicle and battery sectors. In the area of shipping, a $3.6 billion megaport in Chancay, Peru, majority owned by China state-owned COSCO Shipping, was inaugurated in November 2024 by President Xi. The port cuts shipping times to China by approximately 23 days and logistics costs by at least 20%. This was seen as Beijing's plan to reroute trade flows. Capable of accommodating ultra-large container ships, the port allows cargo that once had to detour through Central or North America to head directly across the Pacific to Asia. There are plenty of other Chinese port projects in the Western Hemisphere. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a Washington think tank, Beijing is involved in 37 port projects across Latin America. In the energy sector, China's foothold is equally deep. Through a string of acquisitions, Chinese companies have gained control of more than half of Chile's energy industry and the bulk of Peru's power transmission network. At COP30 in Brazil in 2025, China's presence was highly visible. Its national pavilion at the venue hosted a number of events, and diplomats and companies were busy laying the groundwork for more collaborations across Latin America. The United States government did not participate officially in COP30. Chinese EV maker BYD had already opened a factory in Brazil, and there are plans for Chinese solar parks in Cuba.
China and Latin America are complementary to one another. Traditionally, China has been capital-rich, resource-poor, and Latin America has been resource-rich, capital-poor. So for the past 20 years, this has been a great partnership where Chinese capital came in to build infrastructure, to facilitate trade, to do investment, and natural resources and food and mining materials and all sorts of oils and minerals flowed back to China. So it was a very complementary relationship.
For many decades, the United States in particular has completely neglected engaging with Latin America on the economic front, to such an extent that there has been a huge demand for capital, for technological engagement, as well as for mutually supportive economic engagements of all kinds, especially in terms of trade involving huge amount of commodities and produce produced in Latin America. That is the background.
Chinese investment in the region has not been without problems. Over in Ecuador, the Energy Ministry awarded a 20-year contract for the Sacha oil field to a Chinese-Canadian consortium, sparking protests from unions, indigenous organizations, and opposition politicians who alleged that due processes were not followed. In the Lithium Triangle of Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia, local communities have voiced concerns about environmental destruction.
Ahora quiere vender el litio en nombre de la energía limpia, pero a costa de contaminar las salinas, destruir la Puna, los valles, Jujuy y envenenar a nuestros pueblos.
Over in Panama, Hong Kong company CK Hutchison bought 2 terminals in the canal in 1997, and in 2025, Panama came under fire from Trump.
The Panama Canal was built by Americans for Americans, not for others, but others could use it. We didn't give it to China. We gave it to Panama, and we're taking it back.
In 2017, Panama was the first Latin American country to sign up for China's Belt and Road Initiative. It pulled out in 2025 under pressure from the United States. The forced sale of the CK Hutchison ports to an American company remains unresolved as of January 2026.
The key country that we have to keep our eye on right now in Latin America is Panama. This is going to be the most important country in this burgeoning duel between the US and China, because the United States is threatening to shut China out of the Panama Canal Zone. And if they do that, that would be potentially an existential threat to China's trade relationship in this vital part of the world. That means Chinese ships would then have to go all the way around the tip of South America to make that journey. So Panama is going to be the major flashpoint that's coming.
The problems in Panama and Venezuela needs to be seen in the context of Washington's new national security strategy released in November 2025, which said the U.S. will enforce a Trump corollary to the Monroe doctrine. It states, "We want a hemisphere that remains free of hostile foreign incursion or ownership of key assets."
You will find that there is mounting pressure on Latin American governments. I'm going to take the example of Argentina, because Argentina is one of the 3 countries where the so-called Lithium Triangle is situated. We're talking about rich veins of lithium. China is deeply involved in various mining projects in Argentina, in Bolivia, and in Chile. It can't be pushed out without a big shock to the industry. But I think what you will see is that the United States, and they've made this quite explicit, the new ambassador to Argentina, that the US will play a bigger role, that it wants to get greater stakes in the industry and control more of the mining activity. But this is not something which will happen overnight.
The message from the Trump administration has been clear. It wants China to stay away from the Americas. Do you think we'll see a China retreat from the region?
First of all, President Trump and the U.S. government's pretense that they can resurrect the Monroe doctrine or insert the Monroe doctrine to Latin America is completely false. It will never be allowed to happen. China will never allow that to happen. That's the first point. The second point is that China will continue normal economic and trade relations with all the countries in Latin America. Thirdly, depending on what the United States can do, for example, seizing oil tankers registered in Hong Kong or elsewhere, for example, I think China's pledge that they want to defend all the legitimate interests of China in all corners of the world is real and can be backed up by military capabilities. So don't exclude the possibility that if the United States really misbehaves and continues to bully other countries, seizing the assets on the high sea and committing piracy, for example, then they may force China to send military convoys to Latin America to protect the legitimate business interests of China. That probably will corner the United States. Are they really ready for a battle with China? China will never buy any story by any country in the world that they have the military capabilities to deny China's access to the great continent of Latin America. No way. No one in the world of today should ever indulge in that fantasy. If they want to have war, they will get war. If they want to destroy China, they will be destroyed.
Let's say the PLA and Chinese leaders wanted to send the PLA all the way over to Central and South America. They don't have the logistics capability to actually do that and to deploy forces that far. The Chinese are building their security apparatus and their military strategy around a coastal defense strategy in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, not to deploy into the Eastern Pacific.
Just days after the events in Venezuela, President Trump hinted at new targets.
Cuba is, not doing very well right now. That system has not been a very good one for Cuba, and we want to help the people in Cuba.
A day later, it was Colombia.
Colombia is very sick too, and he's not going to be doing it very long.
没有哪个国家可以充当国际警察，没有哪个国家可以自诩为国际法官。
The unpredictability of Donald Trump and where his team is going to go next is something that is incredibly destabilizing and at the same time of an enormous amount of concern. We are just a couple of weeks into this new era in the post-Venezuela era. So countries are scrambling to figure out how do they respond? How do they form coalitions? How do they engage China? How do they balance? One of the things that we've been hearing throughout Southeast Asia, especially in countries like Indonesia, is how this attack in Venezuela that came after U.S. support for Israel in Gaza has just cratered U.S. public opinion in these developing countries. I am just blown away by what I see from key stakeholders across the global South, and even to some extent in G7 countries, about the fall of U.S. credibility and the fall of faith in the U.S. as a stable partner and as a force for good in the world. It is remarkable how fast this has fallen, and I think a lot of developing countries are really struggling. Let's be very clear here that they're not necessarily looking to China as the answer either. Many people have this binary, it's either the US or it's China. China is not always the answer in response to the US.
Cuba is one of 5 communist countries in the world and a longtime friend of China. In Havana, the vintage cars on the road are a sign of just how much the Cuban economy has suffered under American sanctions. The United States placed sanctions on Cuba in 1962, following Cuba's nationalization of American-owned oil refineries without compensation. Many of those sanctions remain in place today, over 6 decades later. Chinese New Year 2025. Cubans and members of the local Chinese community share in the festivities. China has consistently been one of Cuba's top 3 trading partners. China imports mainly minerals, seafood, tobacco, pharmaceuticals, and alcohol from Cuba, while Cuba imports primarily electrical equipment, machinery, vehicles, steel, and plastics from China. Chinese companies have also invested in areas like clean energy and biopharma. Cuba, the target of several failed U.S. attempts at regime change, is now back in Washington's crosshairs.
Cuba is going to be something we'll end up talking about because Cuba is a failing nation right now, very badly failing nation, and we want to help the people. It's very similar in the sense that we want to help the people in Cuba, but we want to also help the people that were forced out of Cuba and living in this country. Do you want to say something about that, Marco, please?
Secretary of State Marco Rubio, whose parents left Cuba for the U.S., puts Havana on notice.
Suffice it to say, Cuba is a disaster.
The United States embargo and sanctions against Cuba has been long-lasting for more than 6 decades, and Cuba is still standing very proudly as an independent country. Now, if President Trump wants to order his military in an invasion against Cuba, first of all, even if they win a technical success, strategically it will be a complete failure, because the United States will demonstrate to the whole world that they will be taking action as a country of aggression, launching an illegal, unjustified invasion. No one can really foretell what will be the outcome of such military invasion by the United States against Cuba. The United States actually tried several times over the past 6 decades or so and failed miserably. The former President Castro has survived all the attempted assassination, and I hope the present Cuban government and the military will also be very well prepared in deal with any kind of encouraging invasion, aggression from the United States against Cuba.
The Cuban president was the only Latin American head of state who attended China's Victory Day parade in 2025. While there is no official arms trade between the countries, the U.S. claims that China has been implicated in illicit weapons transfers to Cuba. It also claims that Cuba is being used as a spy base for China.
To accuse Cuban-China relations and to pin that down as if it is a spy operation, it is completely unjustified. It means that the United States is running for an excuse, possibly to launch an aggression of Cuba.
Unease is growing in Cuba following the threat from Trump. The Cuban economy long depended on subsidized oil from Venezuela, which is now gone. Some in Havana look toward support from a close ally, China.
No hay duda que para Cuba es un peligro y que es una amenaza permanente no tener el apoyo venezolano. Pero, por el otro lado, hay una reacción tal de otras fuentes que van a salir en apoyo de Cuba, porque además Cuba es el próximo. Y ahí yo contaría en primer lugar con China. Hay una información confirmada que hay un enviado chino en La Habana mandado desde ayer de Beijing para acá. La posición rusa.
中方坚定支持地区国家维护拉美和加勒比和平区地位，愿同地区国家和国际社会一道，共同维护拉美和加勒比地区的和平与稳定。没有哪个国家可以充当国际警察，没有哪个国家可以自诩为国际法官。我们愿意同各国共同捍卫国际法权威，反对从零法则，反对干涉内政。
Will China provide security assistance to Cuba?
Well, I think China will do whatever we can to support the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of Cuba and the well-being of the Cuban people. After all, we have been dealing with each other as brothers and sisters for decades. Now, if I read and listen very carefully to what President Trump has said in recent days about Cuba, he wants to maximize the embargo against Cuba, cutting off any supply of oil or gas to Cuba, cutting off financial flow to Cuba, try to suffocate Cuba, to create chaos in Cuba, and to trigger color revolution or regime change. The Cuban government and the Cuban people can survive the maximum bullying because they have been dealing with such maximum bullying from the United States for decades, and they've come up with their own survival methodology.
There are people in Latin America now asking how China's global security initiative can protect them in real-world scenarios. What is your response?
In terms of the overall military capacities, the Chinese PLA is a complete match against the US military. In some crucial aspects, the Chinese military capabilities are even far exceeding that of the United States. Therefore, the United States should not indulge in any fantasy that in terms of a war, conventional or non-conventional war, the United States can overwhelm China without suffering devastating consequences. That being the case, I would say, at this particular moment, I don't think China wants to use military capabilities against the United States. Maybe this is the better time to see how the United States will fully expose itself as to its true color, as to how much of a greater depth it can plunge into in terms of accelerating the demise of Pax Americana. How much they want to do to make sure that everyone in the world, the Danes, for example, the Europeans, the Italians, you name it, or even the British or the Canadians, who have become convinced that their southern neighbor is not their true friend, and they can see the United States in the true color.
Now that we look at Cuba in its moment of greatest need, if you like, with the prospect that its oil which has been its lifeline from Venezuela for the last 20 years will now end completely as the US exerts its control over the Venezuelan oil industry, and that Russia, another of its lifelines, is too preoccupied with the war in Ukraine to give great aid, then who is going to come to Cuba's rescue at this moment? I'm not sure China is going to go out on a limb to save the government in Havana. China would risk stoking tensions with Washington were it to play its cards in Cuba and provide considerable aid or investment or emergency fuel reserves.
Speaking to reporters on his plane after the Venezuela operation, President Trump hinted Colombia could also be next.
Colombia is very sick too, run by a sick man who likes making cocaine and selling it to the United States, and he's not going to be doing it very long, let me tell you.
What does that mean? He's not going to be doing it very long.
He's not doing it very long. He has cocaine mills and cocaine factories. He's not going to be doing it very long.
So there will be an operation by the U.S. and
it sounds good to me.
Colombians poured into the street to protest the threat. Colombia is the fourth largest economy in Latin America in 2025. Historically, Colombia has been Washington's closest ally in the region. But President Petro, who was elected on a left-wing platform in 2022, has emerged as one of Trump's fiercest critics. China is now Colombia's second largest trading partner after the United States. China has also invested heavily in Colombia with infrastructure projects and mining operations. Significant projects include the Ituango hydropower plant, invested by the Power Construction Corporation of China. It is the largest installed hydropower station under construction in the Americas and will solve 18% of Colombia's electricity demand once finished. Chinese companies are also involved in the building of the metro system in the capital, Bogota. When leaders of the two countries met, President Xi said the two sides can further expand cooperation in fields such as wind power, new energy vehicles, digital economy, and artificial intelligence.
Es lo que te estoy diciendo. Ya esa posición de ser paria y de estar de segundón detrás de los Estados Unidos creo que queda en el pasado. Y hay que mirar a ambos lados. No dejo de mirar a Estados Unidos, que es importante. Miramos al sur de nuestro continente y a los dos lados, y eso significa el mundo. La transformación de Colombia está abierta al mundo.
The decline in US-Colombian relations is an extraordinary thing to watch. We are looking at the deterioration of the alliance, which is perhaps the strongest that the United States has had in South America for the last few decades, rooted obviously in extraordinary US support for the fight against drug trafficking, for the fight against guerrillas, best expressed in Plan Colombia, through which the United States donated something in the region of $12 billion in largely military support for the Colombian government. The United States it has partnerships in prosecution services, police forces, military services, military forces. It has a huge embassy in Bogota, and yet at the moment you would say that there are few worse political relationships than the United States and Trump's ties with Gustavo Petro, the left-wing leader of Colombia at the moment. I think China has watched this deterioration with a degree of curiosity, amusement, and a sense that here is an opportunity which it should not miss. There was an interesting interview last year with the Chinese ambassador to Colombia, who pointed out that within Chinese political circles, Trump was known as comrade because he was doing so much to China's benefit.
This is the best moment for China, because China, without firing a single shot, has made it believable for everyone in the world that the United States is not a real defender of freedom, a defender of peace, a defender of sovereignty and territorial integrity of other countries.
January 5th, 2026. Protesters demonstrated outside the U.S. consulate in Rio de Janeiro, expressing support for Venezuela and condemning the United States' actions.
Se deixar, vai acontecer com o Brasil, com Cuba, com a Bolívia, com o México. Tem que dar basta nesse batidão louco. O povo americano tem que reagir e o Congresso americano tem que pedir o impeachment do presidente Trump, que ele não passa de bandido do capitalismo selvagem internacional.
Brazil, Latin America's largest economy, has been navigating challenging times in its relationship with the United States. In July 2025, the U.S. slapped an additional 40% tariff on Brazilian goods in response to the jailing of the country's former president, Bolsonaro, who was a Trump ally and a vocal critic of China. The move sparked large anti-U.S. protests in Brazil. The 40% tariff sits on top of a 10% baseline tariff. Brazil is also one of the founding members of BRICS.
BRICS was set up to hurt us. BRICS was set up to degenerate our dollar and take our dollar as the standard, take it off as the standard. And if we lost the world standard dollar, that would be like losing a war, a major world war. We would not be the same country any longer. We're not gonna let that happen. The dollar, you ever hear the expression, dollar is king? The dollar is king. We're going to keep it that way, okay?
Chinese investments have been pouring into Brazil, where Chinese brands have become household names.
I think Brazil is the most important country as far as China is concerned in Latin America, or even in the global south.
Brazil's population is more than 200 million, of which 40% are under 30. It offers a vast consumer base for companies looking for new markets amid a rising tide of protectionism. Chinese ride-hailing giant Didi, known in Brazil as 99, has successfully challenged American company Uber to become a key player in the ride-hailing and food delivery market in the country. Chinese companies, Temu, Shein, and Alibaba, are all expanding aggressively into the e-commerce space there. Chinese automakers, BYD and Great Wall Motors, have also recently opened plants in Brazil. Brazil is the world's 6th largest car market, and Chinese brands are making rapid gains. As local politicians cheered, BYD pledged more support for job creation in Brazil beyond their own manufacturing plant.
We are working closely with the local authorities, industry, and help them to get update technologies. And we are in the process to qualify more than 150 local vendors to be our suppliers.
In the energy sector, China has also poured billions into electricity transmission projects.
When we look at China's engagement in Latin America, there are hierarchies of importance in terms of the states. Not all the states are the same. And when we look at the top of that hierarchy sits Brazil. $171 billion of two-way trade in 2025, a major source of soybean, of minerals, of oil, but more importantly, Brazil is also a major market for Chinese e-commerce, Chinese cars, Chinese technology. So in many ways, it is a much more important partner than Venezuela is economically. Venezuela's oil, let's be sure, is important, but it's not that important for a couple of different reasons. One, the quantities just haven't been that large. When you look at what the Chinese are importing from Saudi Arabia, from the other Gulf countries, even Brazil, and to some extent even the United States, Venezuela's share is very small, again, at about 4 to 5%. China is getting very close to reaching peak oil, so which is another reason when we look down the road, 15, 20 years down the road, we're not going to see more reliance on imported crude for China. They are shifting faster than any other major economy to sustainable, renewable energy. So right now, losing oil from both Venezuela and Iran is an inconvenience, to be sure, and it presents short-term problems. But long-term, China's future isn't going to rely on imported crude.
Chinese investments in Brazil surged in 2024 to a record $4.2 billion across 39 projects. That made Brazil the third largest destination for Chinese investments that year. Brazil's exports to China have also grown, particularly in beef and soybeans. Brazil's government said that between January and August 2025, 77 million metric tons of soybeans were exported to China. During that period, China imported just 17 million metric tons from the US, according to China's customs data. Soybeans are a sticking point for the Trump administration because the farmers are located in the Midwestern states of Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, and Indiana. These are states that back Trump. Now, many American farmers fear bankruptcy as China, their largest market, closes. Unlike Cuba and Colombia, Brazil hasn't seen any threats from Trump. But the events in Venezuela have undoubtedly complicated Brazil's calculations.
Brazil is a major country. It is with a 200 million strong population. It's not about to bend in the face of US pressure. And it's interesting that days after the capture of Maduro, it signed, after 25 years of negotiations, it signed the EU-Mercosur trade deal, which obviously opens up markets on both sides for trading of goods. And obviously Brazil will want to benefit by greater exports of agricultural goods. It's not just a commercial change, though. It's a sign this is the global order that we believe in, which is based on cooperation and partnership between nations according to rules. And Brazil is going to probably start looking for all those opportunities and partnerships out there which will help defend the multilateral order. But Brazil knows that were it to come to a military conflagration, and hopefully that would never happen, that it would be at a singular disadvantage compared to the United States. No country in Latin America, not even its most powerful and largest, can stand up to the United States on the field of battle, as it were. So they must all look for different forms of protecting themselves and finding a future in this disturbing new world that we're living in.
Nossa região não deseja ser palco de disputas hegemônicas. Há mais de uma década, a CELAC declarou a América Latina e o Caribe como zona de paz. Não queremos repetir a história e encenar uma nova Guerra Fria. Nossa vocação é ser dos eixos de uma ordem multipolar na qual o sul global esteja devidamente representado.
This is what a lot of countries up until now have said. We want to stay out of the great power rivalry. We want to stay out of the fight. That may not be a luxury that they have anymore.
The capturing of Maduro by American forces sparked both protests and celebrations around the world.
¡Que viva María Corina! ¡Que viva! ¡Que viva el Mundo González! ¡Que viva! ¡Que viva mi tío Trump!
In Spain, the Venezuelan diaspora filled Madrid's central square with flags, singing the national anthem of Venezuela and dancing. Over in Argentina, even larger crowds turned up in Buenos Aires to celebrate the fall of Maduro. Elsewhere, the mood is starkly different. In places like Colombia, Brazil, London, and Paris, protesters slammed the U.S. military campaign. At a UN Security Council emergency meeting, even allies like France condemned U.S. action in Venezuela.
I remain deeply concerned that rules of international law have not been respected. Venezuela has experienced decades of internal instability, but it is still possible to prevent a wider and more destructive conflagration. In situations as confused as complex as the one we now face, it is important to stick to principles. Respect for the UN Charter and all other applicable legal frameworks to safeguard peace and security. Respect for the principles of sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of states.
We demand that the United States change its course, cease its bullying and coercive practices, and develop relations.
China now is increasingly taking the role as the chief critic of the U.S. intervention because many smaller and medium-sized states are nervous about criticizing the U.S. for fear that it would provoke a reaction from Trump and from the Americans. So they're really looking to China to take that lead.
Besides the events in Venezuela, the update of the Monroe Doctrine in the U.S. has also sparked outrage in some places. This doctrine goes back to 1823, when U.S. President James Monroe detailed the idea of an American sphere of influence and warned European powers to give up their colonial pursuits in the Western Hemisphere. In 1904, the doctrine was amended, giving the U.S. power to intervene militarily in Latin American countries. As U.S. military power grew, it sent its armed forces to Nicaragua, Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, and it helped overthrow governments in Argentina, Chile, Bolivia, and Brazil. This Monroe Doctrine now has a new update, known as the DONRO. U.S. government document states the country will enforce a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, and that we, the U.S., want a hemisphere that remains free of hostile foreign incursion or ownership of key assets, and that supports critical supply chains. And we want to ensure our continued access to key strategic locations.
In talking about those strategic assets, we are referring to ports, key choke points in global trade, or anything which is a potential security threat to the United States in itself. And in that regard, there is, of course, great concern in the United States about the potential role of China. We saw that last year with the efforts to remove Chinese firms from the control, any sort of control of the Panama Canal. We know that the major port built and run by the Chinese in Peru would be another concern. And of course, anything regarding mining and the production and processing of rare earth is going to be another matter of concern. But when it comes to large-scale Chinese business activities in the region, whether it's exports of solar panels or electric vehicles, I don't think the United States would be concerned. And if it was concerned, I think it would face the wrath, probably in private, of Latin American governments and political leaders saying, no, this is vital to our economy.
You're not going to see a China retreat from Latin America, but you're going to see a much more cautious China. You're going to see a much more cautious host governments in Latin America as well. And it's not going to be spread evenly across the region. So Brazil-China relationship, I think, is going to flourish and going to boom. At the same time, they're forecasting a 5 to 10% increase in soybean exports out of Argentina. A lot of that's going to go to China. So we're going to see a pretty robust trade relationship that probably will not slow. Again, we're going to probably see the downturn in big projects and also just the type of diplomacy that China was conducting over the past 20 years, which in many ways was frictionless. They could do pretty much anything they wanted, and that's not going to be the case anymore.
This will be a critical shift in human history. Why? Because the biggest economy in the world, the strongest military in the world, now does not want to pretend it still cares about values. It can come up with any fabrication of any excuse, any lie, any fabrication they can find convenient, try to achieve their goal. Their goal is to grab your land, grab your country, grab your oil, grab your natural gas, and arrest your president or your head of state. So the rest of the world, the rest of mankind will know better now that the United States is not that much of a friend that they want to become, to believe, and China is not that much of an enemy that the United States wants to describe. And they need to rebalance themselves and try to find a new equilibrium